Hello everybody and welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm your host Brian Stuart. In this lesson we're going to be talking about earth science. And this is an interesting topic for me because my dad is a geologist. My father is a geologist. In Korean, you say jijilhakja, right? Okay, so my dad is a geologist, and I grew up, learning from my dad as well. And it's a very important subject, of course, talking about earth science. In this lesson, lesson 7, we'll be talking about land and water. So in this lesson, you will discover different features of land. Features, that's an interesting word. Features are like characteristics. If I talk about my face, I could say I have different features on my face. Nose, eyes, mouth. If we look at land, there are many different features. Mountains, valleys, plains. These are different features of the land. Well, let's take a look at some of these different features. First of all, let's take a look at one interesting feature. It's a river. This is a good picture of a river. Rivers can be very wide, right? Especially the Mississippi River in America is really wide. Mississippi. Can you say that quickly? Mississippi. The Mississippi River is very wide. Sometimes rivers are smaller, narrower, but they all have one thing in common, and that is the water in a river is moving. If the water is not moving, it's a lake. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But a river is a long, moving piece of water. So the key word here is moving. If the water is moving, it is a river. If it's not moving, it's not a river, it's something else. So a river is a long piece of water that is moving along. Sometimes it's very fast and it's dangerous. You got to be careful. But sometimes it's slowly moving along. And it's very beautiful, very scenic. Okay. As I said before, if the water in a lake, the water in a river, especially a wide river, is not moving, then we call it a lake, right? A lake is a large area of water. A lake is smaller than an ocean. This is a small lake. Looks like it's in the mountains. Very beautiful, picturesque lake. And of course, this water will probably be very clear and good to drink probably too. It's high up in the mountains, right? It's a nice little lake. This is a small lake. Sometimes lakes are really big, so big you can't see across them. But lakes are a large area of water. And another important feature about lakes, lakes have fresh water, okay? So you can drink it, okay? So lakes have fresh water. Okay, let's move on to the next feature. The next feature we're talking about is mountain. We saw a mountain just before. We saw the lake in the mountains, right? But we could also just look at the mountains as a feature of land. A mountain, what is a mountain? A mountain is the highest kind of land. If you think about that, where is the highest place on earth? If you guess Mount, and MT stands for mountain, Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the highest place on land. It's in the Himalayas between China and India, right? In the Himalayan mountains. Okay? A mountain is the highest kind of land. A mountain is very steep. Steep is a good word. Steep means it has a very strong angle going up like this. If you look at the mountains, they're very steep. That means it's very hard to climb them, right? Sometimes you have to climb them like this. You have to climb the mountains because they're very steep. The angle, their sides are very, they go up very quickly. They are steep mountains. Okay. Another feature of the land is a plain. Now, we can see plains in many areas. What are some features of the plains? Well, of course, one feature is that it's flat, right? And well, that's what we have here. A plain is a flat land. It's a flat area of land, a very flat piece of land. There are not many trees on a plain. We talked about forest before, right? But on a plain, you don't have many trees. If you have many trees, that's a different feature. That's a forest, right? That's a different type of habitat for animals. But a plain is a large flat piece of land with no trees. In the middle of America, the Great Plains, many buffalo used to roam on the plains, very wide open. You can see for a very far distance. And a long time ago, you could see great, huge herds of animals on these plains. And in Africa, too, when you go to the plains, you can see many animals roaming around on the plains. But the two features, flat, not many trees, and usually you have a lot of grass that the animals can eat. That's a plain. Also, we have hill or hills, right? A hill is a high area of land, but it's not a mountain, right? Hills are small, right? Mountains are very large. So a hill is a higher area of land. If you have a plain, that's very flat, but sometimes the land will come up like this. And sometimes we call gentle rolling hills. That's a very nice feature of land. Gentle rolling hills. That's where the land is just very gentle, going up and down, like the wave on an ocean. But of course, these waves don't move, right? Because they're hills. They don't move. They stay like this. And these hills are just a higher piece of land above the plains or above the flat land. A hill is a higher area of land. A hill, of course, is smaller than a mountain, right? If you look at something and say, wow, that's a mountain, somebody might say, you call that a mountain? That's a hill, right? Because they don't think it's very high, right? It's not that high, so it's a hill, okay? Let's move on. A cliff. Now, a cliff can be dangerous. Be careful, right? Here it says, a cliff is a high, steep part of the land. We can also say a cliff is a sudden drop or a sudden rise in the land. It depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from this direction, the cliff is a sudden drop, right? So be careful, right? But if you're coming from this way, then the cliff is a sudden rise in the land. So a cliff can be a sudden drop, or rise this way in the land. A sudden drop or rise in the land. And that's what a cliff is. Cliffs can be dangerous, but also cliffs can sometimes be fun. But be careful when you're with cliffs. We're going to see a little video here. Here's a bunch of young men, boys perhaps, on top of a cliff. What are they doing up there? Are they just looking around? Let's see what they're doing. Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Oh, okay. Whew. There's water at the bottom of the cliff. Whew. This is very dangerous, of course. Be careful if you do this. Be very careful. Don't jump off cliffs unless you know that there's water underneath and there's enough water that will catch you and you won't hit the bottom when you hit that water, right? This guy's very brave, right? But be very careful if you do this type of activity, right? But it's very fun, looks exciting, right? Be very careful. Okay, let's move on. Valleys. Valleys are also a good feature of the land. Very beautiful feature of the land, especially in, for example, Switzerland or some places in Europe. Here this looks like perhaps the American West or some parts of Asia. Here we have the plains on the top, right? The land is kind of flat. We have some hills in the background, but all of a sudden you have the drop, and these are cliffs on the side. And at the bottom, we would say this is a valley. A valley is the lowland between mountains or hills. Well, you could say that these could be mountains, I guess. It's kind of like a plain going along here, and then suddenly we have cliffs, and then the valley is at the bottom. The valley is the lowland at the bottom of the cliffs. And valleys, of course, we find them typically, of course, in mountains, between one mountain and another mountain, also between hills. Some valleys can be very beautiful, right? You have lots of trees. You usually have a river running through the valley because the river is what created the valley. The water cut through, and that's not very obvious in this picture. The water actually cut through the ground and made this valley. So that's a very interesting feature of the land. Okay, another feature of the land is a stream. Now, we've already talked about rivers, right? Rivers are very big, they're very wide, but streams are very narrow. You could probably step across a stream, right? You could probably step from one side to the other. But some streams are a little bit wider, you can't step across. But a small river is, we call those streams. Now, streams and rivers usually come from the mountains, right? So in the mountains, of course, there's water high up on the mountains. The water has to come down from the mountains. So if there's a lot of water, a river comes down. But if there's only a little bit of water, then a stream will come down. So streams usually come from mountains, and also rivers usually come from mountains. Okay, so we've learned a lot of good words about features of the land, some ways to describe the land, and how do we describe these different features. Well, now that we've learned these words, let's move on and let's do a little bit of review with some exercises. We have our words here. What we need to do, match each word with its definition. So these will be definitions, and these are the words that we have to match to these different definitions. Let's start with number 1. A high area of land which is smaller than a mountain. Okay, so we've talked about that before. It's a higher area of land, but it's not as high as a mountain. It's not that big. Remember when I talked about somebody who said, wow, that's a mountain. And the other person said, you call that a mountain? That's not a mountain. It's a hill. It's a hill. And that's our word right over here, hill. Okay, so a high area of land which is smaller than a mountain, we call that a hill. Okay, so what one person might call a mountain, if one person lives in the plains and they don't see many hills or mountains, they might come to a place and say, wow, look at that mountain, but it's just a small hill. The other person's from the mountains and say, that's not a mountain, that's just a hill. So it's not as big as a mountain. Okay, number 2. A flat land not having many trees. So a flat area of land, not many trees on it, usually there's grass on it. And what do we call that type of land? We call that, of course, a plain. That is a plain. Flat land, not many trees, maybe a few trees, but usually grass growing on the land. You can see for really far. Those are plains. 3, the highest kind of land. The highest kind of land. Remember Mount Everest, right? Which is very steep, and Mount Everest is very steep. You have to be a very skilled mountain climber to climb up Mount Everest. And I gave you the answer right there. Of course, it's mountain. You have to be a skilled mountain climber to climb up to some very high mountains. Okay, so mountain. Let's move on to 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. Here we have number 4, a long moving piece of water. Remember, the key word is moving, right? It is moving. The water is moving along. And it's a long moving piece of water. Then we call that, of course, a river, which is over here. That is a river. Number 5, we say a high, steep part of the land. A high, steep part of the land. Also, remember I talked to you guys about that. It depends if you're on top and you come to it, it's a sudden drop. Or if you're at the bottom, you come along and you hit the bottom, or it's a rise in the land. What do we call that? That's a cliff, and we saw those boys jumping off the cliff, right? Make sure there's water on the bottom of the cliff before you jump. Don't jump off cliffs. It can be dangerous. Okay, number 6. A large area of water which is smaller than an ocean. So a large area of water, smaller than an ocean or a sea, and it's usually fresh water, right? What do we call that? We call that a lake. Remember, if water is not moving and it's a large piece of water, that's a lake, right? But if it's moving, then it's a river. Okay, let's move on. We have a nice chart here that shows the 2 different categories, I guess, of features of land. We can categorize these features into 2 main groups. One is land and one is water. So let's take a look over here, starting with land. What kinds of features on land can we find? Well, of course, first of all, we have a mountain up here, and this is a very impressive looking mountain, isn't it? It's very tall, very steep. It's got a nice shape to it. Looks like it's covered in snow, because mountains, of course, are the highest areas of land. They're very high in the air. It's colder up there, so snow will collect up there. Okay, so this is a good example of a mountain. Next, we have a hill here. This looks like a little sign right there in the hill. But a hill, of course, is just a higher part of the land. you have the flat land here, and then a slight rise, that's a hill. So somebody who's living, who lives out in the plains and they don't see many hills or mountains, they may come to a large hill and they might say, wow, look at the mountain. And then somebody who's next to that person might say, and they're from, somebody who's from the mountains, who's next to that person might say, you call that a mountain? That's just a hill, right? So, hills could be mountains to some people, but just hills to other people. Depends on where you're from. Of course, if it's very small, it's very obvious it's just a hill. Okay, let's move on down around our chart here. Over here we have a plain. Now this is an interesting looking plain. Actually, it looks like a farmer has planted some type of crop on this plain. We could also call that a field in that case. A farmer will plant crops in a field, right? But plains and fields are very similar. So another word in this case that we could use is a field. And a field, a farmer will come along, find a nice plain and plant crops, and then we call that a field. But let's take a look at a video of a plain in nature, a natural plain that hasn't been touched. Let's take a look. This is a picture of a plain that hasn't really been touched by a farmer. You can see the light is changing from dark to light, and that's because the clouds are moving over the sun. But that's a very good example of a plain. It's a very nice and peaceful looking place. Of course, it's flat, as we saw. Not many trees grow on the plain. I mean, if we go over here, there's trees over there, but that's not plain anymore. We call that forest. But this open area, we call a plain. And you can see a lot of grass is another common feature on plains. Animals will eat the grass. And usually we'll see large groups of animals here and there on the plains. For example, cows, horses, deer, those types of animals. Especially if you go to Africa, you'll see a lot of wild groups of animals, right? Like wildebeest or zebras, right? Running around on the plains, and they eat the grass. And of course, behind them come the lions, right? Okay, let's move on our chart for land. Here we have valley. Valley, of course, is another feature of land, and a valley is a low area of land between mountains or hills. Usually there's a river at the bottom of a valley. Let's take a look at a video of a valley. This is a video. This looks like actually, I think this is the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon, of course, is in Arizona. My parents live near the Grand Canyon. They're not very far. So I've been to the Grand Canyon a few times. This looks like part of the Grand Canyon. I'm not sure exactly where this is. But in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you see a stream, a river actually. By the way, I was using another word. Did you catch it? Canyon, which is another feature of land. Now a canyon, you can also say the valley is down here. But a canyon, we can also say this is a good example of a canyon. Of course, the Grand Canyon's very famous, world famous. But you can see these cliffs. It's just a really impressive, very amazing canyon. This river actually cut through the land over millions of years to make this valley, this canyon coming through. And it's a very dry area in this case. It's in the desert, so it's very beautiful, especially when the sun rises and the sun sets. The light changes these cliffs to many different colors of orange and red and pink. It's very beautiful. Okay, but this is a good example of a valley, or in this case, a canyon as well. This is also a good example of a canyon. Usually for a valley, we'll say, it's a little bit more gentle, right? That it's not so steep, and there's a lot of greenery around. And then I would say that that's more of a valley. But canyons are kind of a special type of valley, especially you find them in the desert where the river, the water has cut the land and left a lot of cliffs. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now we're talking about different types of water features on the land. Here we have a stream, and right before, remember I talked about a stream, usually you can step across a stream, or you could probably maybe jump across this stream, right? It's different from a river which is very wide. You couldn't step across this river, and I don't think you could jump across this river either. But anyway, we have a nice video of a stream. Let's take a look at a video of a stream to get a better idea. Oh, this looks like a nice stream here, right? You can see the water moving along. Oh, there's a nice little bridge because this stream is a little hard to jump over or step over. But you'll notice also streams, they're not that deep, right? You could walk across the rocks here if you wanted to, and that's a nice stream. Actually, this stream, it makes me think of going fishing, right? If we had a couple fishing poles, right, we could go fishing for fish in these deep pools along the stream. But of course, streams are moving water. We can see the water that is moving over these rocks, okay? And of course, that's different from a river, which is very wide, and rivers are usually deeper. You couldn't really cross the river on rocks because the rivers are deeper, and rivers are moving a lot faster if they're narrow, and it's dangerous to cross a river, so be very careful. And of course, sometimes rivers are very wide. They might be slow moving, but then you'd have to swim across the river. You couldn't walk across it or use rocks to jump across the river. Okay, let's move on down here. We have ocean is also a feature that has to do with water. And if you're standing on the side of an ocean, of course, it's very wide. You can't see the other side. And oceans are usually salt water, very big a body of water. Most of the earth is covered in oceans, okay? And that is, of course, opposed to a lake. You can see the difference, really. At an ocean, you can't see the other side. But usually, most lakes, you can see the other side. There are exceptions, of course, especially the Great Lakes in America, between America and Canada. Those lakes are so big, you can't see across the other side. It's like an ocean. But we still call them lakes. Why? Because they're fresh water. So we call those lakes the Great Lakes. So lakes are usually fresh water. And we have a good video of a lake here. Here's a video. We can see the water. Now, remember I said lakes, the water doesn't move? But hey, the water is moving. But this water is not flowing from a higher place to a lower place. What's going on is the wind is pushing the water on the top. It looks like the water's moving, and it is moving, but just on the surface, right? The water on this side of the lake is not flowing to this side of the lake. That's not what's going on. If it was, that would be a river. This water is staying put. It's not going anywhere, right? But the wind is pushing the top of the water along. It looks like it's moving, but lakes, the water usually stays here. Now, of course, there might be a stream that comes into the lake. There might be another stream that goes out of the lake, and maybe some of the water is moving, but most of this water, this body of water is staying put. It doesn't move. It doesn't flow from one place to another, and we call that a lake. Okay, so two kinds of water on earth. And we talked about that a little bit already, right? We've talked about salt water, and we've talked about fresh water. Let's take a little bit more closer look at each in more detail. When we talk about salt water, we're talking, of course, about an ocean. An ocean is made up of salt water. So like I said before, oceans cover most of the earth. Most of the earth is covered in salt water. Now, many living things cannot drink salt water. If we go to the ocean, we can't drink this water. It'll taste bad, and it will make us sick. So we can't drink salt water, and we shouldn't drink salt water. We can play in it, we can swim in it, we can dive and look down in it. Fish live in it. Coral grows in salt water, but we cannot drink it, and that's an important feature of salt water. However, fresh water we can drink. Fresh water is water without salt. There's no salt in this water. Many living things can drink fresh water. So we can drink the water in rivers and lakes. However, I would not drink the water from a river that runs through a city because there's no salt in this water, but there might be other things like some pollution or runoff or some things that the people in the city, is going in the water. So don't drink that water, but it is fresh water. Usually this water has to be treated, has to run through a water treatment plant so that we can drink it. Streams, rivers, and lakes are fresh water. If you go into the mountains or you get away from cities, you go out into the country and you see a stream or a river, you might be able to drink that water. But always be careful about drinking water in the wild because sometimes there might be some bacteria or bugs in that water that could make you sick. So be careful. Ask people, is this water safe to drink? Is this water safe to drink? Okay, but usually fresh water, people can drink it. Animals, of course, can drink it. Animals don't have to worry about those types of things. They just go down, they drink the water. Okay, so let's review a little bit with some true-false questions. If the sentence is true, we circle T. If it's false, we circle F. Number one, a lake is larger than an ocean. True or false? Obviously, it is false because lakes, as we said before, lakes are smaller than oceans. I said the Great Lakes in America, yeah, they're very big. You can't see across them, but all of those lakes, none of those lakes are as big as the Atlantic Ocean, and certainly not as big as the Pacific Ocean, right? So oceans are bigger than lakes. Lakes are smaller. Number two, there are many trees on a plain. Is that true or false? If you chose false, you are correct. The idea of a plain is that there are not many trees. If there are many trees, then we call it a forest. It's not a plain anymore, right? A plain usually has grass, right, growing on it, but not trees. We can see for a very long distance on a plain. If there are many trees, we can't see for a very long ways. Okay, so number three, a cliff is a high, flat part of the land. Now this is an interesting idea here. A cliff is a high, flat part of the land? No, how can it be high and flat? Flat means like, from side to side. So a cliff is a high, flat part of the land. That has to be false, right? Because it's not flat, it's vertical. Okay? Vertical is different from flat. Vertical. Vertical goes up and down. Here, I'll draw it over here. Up and down. That's vertical. Flat is this way. We can also say flat. There's another word we can use, and that is horizontal. Let's practice those two words. First, we have vertical, up and down. Then we have horizontal, flat. Okay? A cliff is not horizontal. A cliff is vertical. So this is not correct. A cliff is a higher sudden drop in the land. It's a sudden drop or a sudden rise in the land. That's a cliff. So it's false. They're all false. False, false, false. Okay? So a little review there. Okay, well, let's take an intermission here, and then we'll get into the reading part in just a little bit. Okay, everybody, welcome back. It's time to go over the reading section. So let's read a short passage about the concepts and the ideas that we've just studied about. Of course, we're continuing on the theme of land and water. This passage has to do with land. The first sentence, the earth has many different shapes. Okay, the earth has many different shapes. It has many different features. There are many different parts of the land. And we talked about a lot of those different types of land, those features of the land. And that there are many different kinds of land. So actually, these two sentences are very, very similar in meaning. They're almost the same, really. The earth has many different shapes or features, and there are many different kinds of land, as we have discovered, right? So we're going to talk about, this passage is going to be talking about different types of land, classifying, different types of land, and describing what makes those types of land unique and different from each other. So at the first one, we're talking about cliffs. At the end of land, there are many cliffs. Well, not all land, of course. At the end of some land. I mean, you don't always have this. Sometimes you have a shallow, it comes down to a beach. But at the end of some land, when it goes into the ocean, right, you have a cliff. And a cliff, again, is a sudden drop or a sudden rise, depending on your direction, right? A cliff is a high, steep part of the land. Remember we talked about steep, and I also taught you about vertical. Steep and vertical aren't the same. Steep can also be like this, right? Steep can also be like this, but vertical is up and down. This is obviously vertical. This is very dangerous too. Be careful, lady, right? Don't get too close to the edge. Okay, so those are cliffs, and cliffs are very scenic, as we can see. A mountain is the next type of land that we're going to talk about. A mountain is the highest kind of land. It's the highest part of the land that you can get to by climbing or walking, or climbing usually. It is very steep. Okay, so steep, remember, you can see the sides of the mountain. They're very steep. They go up very sharply, okay? A hill is another type of land, but it's a high area of land. However, it is smaller than a mountain. So we can see it's a higher, right? It's a higher part of the land. It's not as steep. Remember, I taught you gentle rolling hills. This is a very gentle slope. This is a very steep slope. And also, hills are very small, right? Especially compared to these mountains, which are very, very high. By the way, I want to point out one thing. This is an interesting punctuation mark. This right here is a semicolon. Why did we use a semicolon? Whoops, that's not an E, sorry. I'll cross that out. Semicolon. I meant to draw a C. Semicolon. A semicolon is used here. This is a complete sentence. This is one sentence, right? But this is also another sentence. These are two sentences that are complete, independent of each other, right? We could just put a period here and put it capital I and have a new sentence, and that would be fine. But we use a semicolon to join two complete sentences that are closely connected in meaning. A hill is a high area of land. That's one thing about a hill. Another thing about a hill is that it is smaller than a mountain. So these two sentences are very closely connected. They both describe a hill, and they are very closely connected also in their construction, the way that they are written. So we can use a semicolon to connect those two sentences. Sometimes you will see that. Okay? So a semicolon can be used to connect two complete sentences. It's a good example. Okay, let's move on. Okay, valleys and plains. Those are other types of land, other features of land. There are lowlands, right? Usually, of course, they are lower land than the surrounding hills or mountains. A valley is a low area of land or low land between mountains, like this. It's a low area. Of course, these are higher areas. The valley is lower. So, valley is a low land between mountains and between hills as well. We talked about a plain. A plain is a flat area of land, as we can see here. There are not many trees on the land. So the two features of the plain that they're talking about, one, it is flat. Two, there are not many trees on the plain. So two features of the land, okay, of the plain here. Okay, let's move on. Another feature of the land is a river. Now remember what we talked about a river? What makes a river unique, different from, for example, a stream? It's large. It's large. What makes a river different or unique from a lake? It's moving. So large moving piece of water. A river is a large piece of water that is moving, and it is large. Okay. Of course, a stream is a small river. Streams and rivers are very similar, but just remember, streams are smaller, narrower. Rivers are wider, larger. Streams usually start at a mountain and finish at a beach. Of course, we can also say rivers also usually start at a mountain and finish at a beach. Okay? It's a very interesting area, by the way. If you're at the coast, if you're by the ocean, and you see a river coming out through the land and across the beach, the water is flowing, that's a very interesting place to be, because you've got the fresh water coming out of the mountains meeting the salt water in the ocean. It's very interesting. Okay. A lake is another type or feature of the land. A lake is a large area of water, as we saw, but remember, a lake is not as big as an ocean. Okay? So we have the three different types of land we're talking about here, pictured here. A river, a stream, and a lake. Okay. Okay, now we've come to our reading skill, and our reading skill here is to classify. And the reading passage we just studied is a good example or a good case study for the classification skill, because the reading passage was talking about different shapes of land or different features of the land. And when we take a look at a group of things and we say they're different, they're unique, we can classify them, meaning we can put them into different groups according to their unique features or their unique definitions. So over here we have the different features of the land: cliff, mountain, hill, beep, we have to figure that out, and plain. Those are the different features, and we can classify them according to their definition, right? How do we define them? And these are the definitions here. Well, let's of course start with A. We have to put a word in here. Our words are down here: mountain, steep, flat, valley, highest. Now we already know that this word is going to be a feature of the land. So we have here mountain is a feature of a land, valley. So really our only two choices are between mountain and valley, because only those two words would fit in the types or shapes or features of the land, right? So let's take a look. What is the definition of this mystery word? The definition is It is a lowland between two mountains. So the lowland between two mountains, right? We talked about that before. Is that a mountain? No. A mountain is lowland between two mountains? That doesn't make sense. So a valley, right? Valley is a lowland between two mountains. So A, of course, is valley, right? That's our choice there. Let's move on to B. Jump back up. We're talking about a cliff. That is our feature of the land. Our definition. A cliff is a high, beep kind of land. Now, what word goes here? Of course, we're not going to use mountain or valley. Those belong over here. So we need to choose between steep, flat, or highest, right? Of course, steep would be the best choice here. It is a high, steep kind of land, a cliff. In fact, cliffs are usually vertical, right? Vertical, remember, is a type of steep. Steep can be vertical, or steep can be, not vertical, but very sharp or very strong slope, or very difficult slope. So steep can be anywhere from maybe 45 degrees to 90 degrees. 90 degrees, of course, is vertical, up and down. So steep. Cliffs don't always have to be up and down. Cliffs can be like this too, right? Okay. So it's a high, steep kind of land. That is a cliff. What about mountain? Mountain, it is the beep kind of land. It is the, where do you use steep? Flat kind of land? Mountains are flat? Or the highest? I think we should use highest here. It is the highest kind of land. So if you chose highest, you're correct, right? Mountains are the highest kind of land. We use the example of Mount Everest, which is the highest point on earth, right? The highest kind of land. A hill. It is a high area of land, yes. It is smaller than a beep. Okay, what are hills smaller than, right? We talked about that a lot, right? You might see a hill. It might be a large hill. Hills can be small. You can also have large hills. But hills are always smaller than a mountain, right? A hill is smaller than a mountain. And hills are usually not as steep as a mountain. That's another distinction. Sometimes they can be. Sometimes hills can have steep sides, but usually they're not. They're more gentle, usually. But they are smaller than mountains. Okay. We talked about valley already. Let's go down to plain. This is our last one, F. Plain. It is a beep area of land. There are not many trees on it. So when we were talking about plains, we said there are two main features of the plains, right? One, it didn't have many trees on it, right? The other part, it is flat, right? It is a flat area of land. So it's flat. It doesn't rise up. It's horizontal. It's a horizontal piece of land. It is a flat area of land. Okay. Let's move on with some comprehension questions. The first one here, a valley is a lowland between A, rivers, B, plains, or C, mountains. We just talked about this, right? On the previous slide, we saw that a valley is a lowland between mountains. You could also say or hills, right? Because we have valleys between hills too. But anytime when the land is high on both sides and you have a low area of land in between, we call that a valley. Okay? And we also talked about canyon before. It's a special kind of valley. Okay. Number 2, a stream is like a what? A small river, a small mountain, or a high cliff? Well, if you chose a small river, you're right, because we talked about that a lot, right? A stream is smaller, narrower than a river. A river is wider than a stream. So a stream is like a small river, not a small mountain and not a high cliff. Okay? So a stream is like a small river. Okay, let's move on to 3 and 4. At the end of land, and remember, it's not at the end of all land, it's at the end of some land, there are cliffs, which are. So this is a bit more complicated sentence, right? We have to focus on cliffs. That's our subject, which. So whatever our answer is, it's going to be talking about cliffs. It's going to be talking about some distinctive or unique feature of a cliff. What is unique about cliffs? A, they are the high, steep parts of land. B, they are the low, flat parts of land. Or C, have many trees growing on them. Which one seems to be the best? If you chose A, you would be correct. Cliffs are the high, steep, right, usually vertical parts of land, right? There's a sudden drop or a sudden rise in the land. That is what a cliff is. Not low, flat parts of the land. Cliffs are not flat. They're steep or usually vertical. They have many trees growing on them? Well, cliffs might have trees growing on them, but that's not a distinct feature of cliffs. It doesn't matter if there are trees growing on them or not. And in fact, it's kind of hard for trees to grow on a cliff because, you know, trees have to grow up. They don't grow straight out. But sometimes you do see some very strong or very desperate trees growing this way out of cliffs. Sometimes you can see that. Okay, but it's not very common. Okay, number 4. A river usually starts at A. So where do rivers usually start? Okay, we talked about this when we talked about streams, because streams also usually start at the same place. Remember, streams and rivers are basically the same thing. They're water that's flowing from a high place to a low place. But where's the high place that they start at? That's our clue. A plain and finishes at a mountain. So the river starts at a plain and finishes at a mountain? That would be strange because the river would be flowing the wrong way. So A is not correct. B, starts at a lake and finishes at a hill. Again, that's kind of strange. Why would a river start at a lake and then finish at a hill? That's also going up. A river usually starts at a mountain and finishes at a beach. Oh, that makes sense because mountains are high parts of the land. The beach is very low. It's right where the land meets the ocean at the lowest point, right? So that makes sense. And it's true that rivers and streams usually start at a mountain, right? And finish at a beach, usually, but not always. You know, sometimes rivers go underground, right? They finish underground. You might be following a river and then it disappears. It goes underground. Sometimes that does happen. But usually they go all the way out to the sea and they finish at the beach by the ocean. Okay, let's move on. Now remember our chart that we talked about before and we looked at some videos of the different types of land. Now let's review and let's put in the different names of these features of land and water. I will tell you the distinctive features of each piece of land or the type of water, and then together we'll figure out how do we label them, how do we classify them. So let's start, of course, with land. Over here we have a high piece of land, right? The sides are very steep. It's usually the highest part of the land. What do we call it? We call that a mountain. Okay, good. So if you chose mountain, you're correct. Over here we have a picture. Now, this is also a high piece of land, but it's not as high as a mountain. What do we call that? We call that, of course, a hill. Okay, let's move on down here. Here we have a large flat piece of land. There are not many trees growing on this flat piece of land. What do we call it? We call that, of course, a plain. This is a plain. Over here, we have an area of low land. It's low land, and it is between mountains. Okay? Looks like it's between mountains there. So we have an area of low land between mountains. Usually there's a stream or a river at the bottom of it. We call that, of course, a valley. Okay, valley is low land between mountains or hills. Let's move on to water. What do we have here? We have two pictures of moving water, right? This one is smaller, this one is larger. So when we have a small or narrow piece of moving water, we call that a stream, right? Because it's narrow, it's not very big. And we could usually walk across it, maybe step across it, or jump across it. Okay, over here, similar thing, but this water is moving, although it looks like it's not moving, but it is moving, and it's very wide, okay? So we cannot cross it, right? We'd have to swim across it or build a bridge across it or take a boat and paddle across it. That, of course, is a river. River is a large, long piece of moving water. Okay, let's move on down here. Here we have the wave coming in on the sandy beach. This is a very, very large body of water. So large, usually you cannot see across it. Another feature of this type of water is that it has a lot of salt in it. It is salt water. So what do we call it? We, of course, call that an ocean. Okay? Over here we have a smaller body of water. A small body of water, a smaller piece of water. And it's usually fresh water. We could drink that water. Okay, so what do we call that? we would call that a lake. Okay, so that wraps it up for today's lesson. I hope you've learned a lot. And as always, it was kind of an interesting lesson. As I said, I have some kind of special connection with this because my dad's a geologist. But it's very interesting to take a look at the earth around you and look at the different features and think about what are the unique characteristics of each type of land. Well, that's it for today. We'll see you guys next time. Take care, everybody.